when we wrote it. It is like, I've never read anything like it. In order to really tell the story properly, you need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol. It's really ambitious, and it goes from like the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. It's a massive thing, and theologically, it's something that you have to really look at, because it's not all written.
Mel Gibson didn't just invest $30 million into what became the most successful religious film ever made. He walked away from it with questions that challenged everything he thought he understood about Jesus. During his research, he came across something unexpected. Not a conspiracy, not some obscure fringe manuscript, but an ancient Bible preserved for over 1,600 years inside an Ethiopian church. This version contains 81 books, and among them are 15 texts missing from most Western Bibles, texts that speak about something the Western Church has never fully explained: the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. Pause and think about that. The New Testament describes the resurrection, arguably the most important moment in Christian history, and then summarizes the next 40 days in just a handful of lines. Jesus rises, appears to his followers, teaches them briefly, and ascends. That's it. Roughly 8 sentences to cover 40 days of direct teachings from the resurrected Christ. Why so little detail? For centuries, the standard explanation has been simple. Those records were lost. But what if they weren't lost at all? What if they were preserved? Just not in the places Western Christianity was looking. There's a text known as the Book of the Covenant, or Mashafa Kadan. Within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it isn't considered extra or optional. It's part of their biblical canon. And according to its own claims, it documents what Jesus taught during those exact 40 days. Scholars don't fully agree on its origins. Some argue it reflects early Christian teachings from the 1st or 2nd century. Others believe it was written later within the Ethiopian Church. But both sides acknowledge something important. The text is ancient. It exists, and it presents ideas not found in the Western Bible. So why haven't most people heard of it? That question opens a much bigger story, one that may explain why Gibson encountered it long before many Western Christians even knew it existed. Back in 2003, Gibson took a massive risk. He self-funded The Passion of the Christ, pouring in $30 million of his own money. The film was shot entirely in Aramaic and Latin, with no major studio support and no mainstream stars. Hollywood was convinced it would fail. It didn't. The film went on to earn over $600 million worldwide. But what's often overlooked is how deeply Gibson immersed himself in research. He didn't just rely on common interpretations. He consulted historians, theologians, and language experts from a wide range of traditions. And that curiosity didn't end after the film's release. For years, he has been working on a sequel focused on the resurrection. In interviews, he's hinted at drawing from sources outside the traditional Western canon, including the Ethiopian Bible. He's pointed out that it contains additional books, some of which explore the period after the resurrection. And here's the key detail. His upcoming project centers on those exact 40 days. That's the same time frame the Book of the Covenant claims to describe. To understand why Ethiopia preserved these texts while others didn't, you have to look at its history. Ethiopia remained largely isolated for centuries, resisting outside control and maintaining its own religious traditions. In that isolation, ancient texts were carefully copied and protected, generation after generation. While the Western Church formed its canon through councils and empires, Ethiopia followed a different path. And in that difference, something may have been preserved that the rest of the world never fully explored. Across much of Africa, European colonial powers didn't just take land, they transformed entire societies. Governments were dismantled, native languages were pushed aside, and long-standing religious traditions were often treated as obstacles to be replaced. Missionaries frequently arrived with more than scripture. They brought systems meant to reshape local culture entirely. Ethiopia refused to follow that pattern. In 1896, when Italy attempted to colonize the country, Emperor Menelik II organized a military response that would make history. At the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces defeated the Italian army in one of the most significant anti-colonial victories of the 19th century. That victory matters for more than politics. In many colonized regions, indigenous Christian traditions were gradually corrected or replaced by European religious standards. Local biblical traditions were often dismissed, church customs labeled backward, and regional canons brought in line with Western norms. Ethiopia never underwent that process. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed independently from major Western and Eastern centers of Christianity, like Rome and Constantinople. Its theology, liturgy, and biblical canon evolved along a separate path. Its roots go back to the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which officially adopted Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the earliest Christian states in history, even before Christianity became dominant across the Roman Empire. This was not simply an extension of European Christianity transplanted into Africa. It was an ancient Christian tradition, growing in parallel, in a different language, on a different continent, preserving a different collection of texts. That independence would later lead to one of the most surprising discoveries in biblical history. In 1769, Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia searching for the source of the Blue Nile. During his years there, he learned Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, and gained access to monasteries few Europeans had ever entered. What he discovered stunned scholars. Inside Ethiopian monastic libraries, Bruce found complete copies of the Book of Enoch. This was no minor manuscript. The Book of Enoch is one of the most influential writings from ancient Jewish and early Christian tradition. It is traditionally attributed to Enoch, the ancestor of Noah described in Genesis as a man who walked with God. The text includes visions of heaven, accounts of rebellious angels, descriptions of the watchers descending to earth, and prophecies concerning judgment and the end times. Here's what makes this so remarkable. Early Christians knew this text well. The New Testament book of Epistle of Jude directly quotes Enoch. Early church writers such as Tertullian defended its importance. Yet over time, the text largely disappeared from Western Christianity. For roughly 1,600 years, complete copies were unavailable to most of Europe. Then James Bruce brought 3 manuscripts back from Ethiopia in 1773. One was deposited in the Bodleian Library at University of Oxford, allowing scholars to study the full work again for the first time in centuries. The implications were huge. A text directly referenced in the New Testament had survived, not in Rome, Jerusalem, or Constantinople, but in Ethiopian monasteries. That discovery naturally led to a bigger question. If Ethiopia preserved Enoch, what else had been preserved there? To understand that, imagine one of Ethiopia's most extraordinary monasteries, Debre Damo. Located in northern Ethiopia, Debre Damo sits atop a flat mountain surrounded by steep cliffs. There are no roads or stairways leading up. Entry requires climbing a vertical cliff using a leather rope lowered from above. For centuries, this physical isolation acted as protection. Within those walls, monks carefully copied manuscripts by hand generation after generation. While wars, invasions, and political upheaval transformed the outside world, monasteries like Debris Damo remained largely untouched. That isolation preserved texts that outside empires were never in a position to confiscate or standardize. Modern scholars such as Getachew Haley and Ephraim Isaac later helped catalogue and translate many Ethiopian manuscripts for global scholarship. And here's the fascinating part. These texts weren't exactly hidden. They were sitting in monasteries, archives, and church collections the entire time. The real barrier was language. Most Western scholars simply couldn't read Ge'ez. That accidental barrier protected these manuscripts for centuries, preserving an archive of Christian literature that much of the Western world barely knew existed. By the late 20th century, systematic translation efforts finally began opening a library of texts that had remained largely inaccessible for nearly a millennium. What researchers discovered behind those monastery doors wasn't just a slightly different version of Christianity, it was something much bigger, a fully developed parallel tradition, one that had preserved texts the Western world had gone without for over 1,600 years. And within those texts was a possible answer to a question the Western Church has never clearly explained. What did Jesus actually teach during those 40 days after the resurrection? If you grew up in a church and never once heard about these writings, you're not alone. A lot of people are encountering this idea for the first time. To understand why these books aren't in most Western Bibles, you have to rewind all the way back to 325 AD, to the First Council of Nicaea, called by Constantine the Great. At that time, Christianity wasn't unified at all. It was spread across regions with different beliefs, different texts, and different interpretations of who Jesus was. Constantine, having recently elevated Christianity within the Roman Empire, needed consistency. So he brought church leaders together to debate and decide. Over time, through gatherings like Nicaea and later councils in places like Carthage and Hippo Regius, a standard canon began to take shape in the Western world. Certain books were included, others left out, based on questions of authorship, theology, and, as many scholars argue today, how well they supported an organized church structure. And that last part is important. Constantine wasn't just shaping a religion, he was stabilizing an empire. And empires rely on hierarchy. Authority flows from the top down. Now imagine a version of Christianity where individuals could connect directly with God through visions, personal revelation, or spiritual experience, like what's described in texts such as the Book of Enoch or the Book of the Covenant. That kind of belief doesn't fit neatly into a centralized system. If ordinary people could access divine truth without intermediaries, what role would bishops play? And if authority came from personal experience rather than institutional approval, what power would Rome hold? Scholars like Bart D. Ehrman have pointed out that the process of forming the biblical canon wasn't simple or purely spiritual. It involved debate, disagreement, and at times political influence. Texts that reinforce structure and authority were more likely to be preserved in the Western canon, while others, especially those emphasizing personal, inward spirituality, were often excluded. This isn't fringe thinking, it's part of mainstream academic discussion. And here's the key detail. Ethiopia wasn't part of those councils. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed its canon independently. It kept texts that described a more direct, experiential approach to faith, texts that the Western Church didn't include. Those writings remained preserved for centuries, waiting for someone to start asking the right questions. Eventually, people did, including Mel Gibson. While researching his work, Gibson hinted at how complex and layered these traditions are. According to accounts, the Book of the Covenant presents a very different picture of the post-resurrection period. In the New Testament, those appearances are brief and almost fleeting, moments like the road to Emmaus or the gathering by the sea. Short encounters, minimal detail. But in the Ethiopian text, the tone shifts. Jesus is portrayed as teaching extensively, deliberately, like someone trying to communicate something urgent before his time runs out. The focus begins with the nature of reality itself, the structure of creation, the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, and the idea of a true divine source contrasted with a distorted or incomplete version of authority. Then comes a warning. According to the text, Jesus tells his disciples that his teachings won't be changed overnight, but gradually. His name will remain, institutions will grow, but over time, the essence of what he taught could drift. He describes signs to watch for, leaders using faith for gain, outward displays replacing inner transformation, and moments when his message is used to justify harm or control. When you compare that idea with major moments in history, the Crusades, the Inquisition, or other periods of religious conflict, it raises difficult questions. Is that coincidence, interpretation, or something else entirely? That's where this stops being just a story about Ethiopia and becomes something much bigger. Because in 1947, something happened that forced the academic world to take a second look. Near the Dead Sea, a young shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib made an accidental discovery in the caves of Qumran. Inside clay jars were ancient manuscripts, what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts turned out to be some of the oldest known copies of Hebrew scriptures, dating back centuries before the time of Jesus, and among them, fragments of the Book of Enoch. That discovery changed everything, because it proved that Enoch wasn't just a later Christian curiosity, it existed within Jewish communities before Christianity even began. Which raises a powerful question. If texts like Enoch were known, valued, and preserved long before the modern Bible was finalized, what else might still be out there, waiting to be understood differently? Ancient Jewish communities didn't treat these writings as side notes. They valued them enough to preserve them alongside the Torah. And when fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and studied, one detail stood out. Where was the only complete version of the Book of Enoch still intact? Ethiopia. For nearly 2,000 years, Ethiopian monks had been carefully copying this text in Ge'ez, preserving it in monasteries like Debre Damo. When scholars compared those manuscripts to the ancient fragments found at Qumran, the match was striking. The core content aligned in essential ways. That meant something important. Ethiopia hadn't been passing down a distorted version. It had been safeguarding an ancient tradition with remarkable accuracy. Scholars like George W. E. Nicholsburg, a leading authority on Enoch, spent decades analyzing these texts. His work concluded that the Ethiopic version reflects authentic strands of early Jewish and early Christian thought. Think about what that implies. A text referenced in the New Testament, read by early believers, and preserved before Christianity even began, had disappeared from much of the Western world, only to survive in Ethiopian monasteries. So maybe the real question isn't why Ethiopia kept these writings. Maybe it's why the Western tradition stopped reading them. Now there's a section in the Book of the Covenant that many readers find especially powerful because it feels timeless. In this passage, Jesus describes a future era marked by spiritual tension, not with exact dates or predictions, but with patterns. He speaks of a time when love begins to fade, when communities built on shared truth start to fracture, and when outward displays of virtue replace genuine inner change. People will speak openly about faith, but their lives won't reflect it. He warns that the name of God will be used in ways that contradict its purpose, justifying harm, excusing injustice, and masking the pursuit of power. And then comes a line that stops people in their tracks. The process meant to purify won't feel like salvation. It will feel like collapse. It will look like things are falling apart. But those who have truly changed internally will recognize something deeper. They'll carry what the text describes as an inner light, something that cannot be taken away. Scholars like R.H. Charles noted that Ethiopian prophetic writings often work on two levels at once: immediate guidance for the present and broader patterns that repeat across history. So this isn't necessarily about one specific year or moment. It's about every period where substance is replaced by performance, where belief becomes more about appearance than transformation, and where sacred ideas are reshaped for purposes they were never meant to serve. That's why these texts have remained relevant across centuries, and it also explains why monks protected them so carefully, copying them by hand, preserving them through invasions, political upheaval, and isolation. They believed these weren't just old writings. They believed they were carrying something essential. And that brings us to another layer of Ethiopian tradition, one that goes even further back. According to the Kebra Nagast, a foundational Ethiopian text, the Ark of the Covenant is not lost. It is believed to be housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. The tradition claims it was brought there by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, thousands of years ago. The Ark, according to belief, is guarded by a single monk who dedicates his life entirely to that role. He doesn't leave, he doesn't speak publicly. Has this been verified scientifically? No. Access has never been granted for modern examination. The Ethiopian Church doesn't seek outside validation for its traditions, but what is widely accepted is that Aksum was once the center of a powerful ancient civilization, and that trade and cultural connections between the region and the Near East existed for centuries. So whether one sees this as faith, history, or tradition, the conviction behind it is undeniable. And that conviction helps explain something crucial. The monks preserving these manuscripts didn't see themselves as archivists. They saw themselves as guardians of a sacred inheritance. That belief is likely why so many texts survived when others were lost. Here's what can be said with confidence. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains a biblical canon of 81 books, including writings that disappeared from much of Western Christianity over a millennium ago. Some of those texts explore the 40 days after the resurrection, a period the Western New Testament summarizes only briefly. Some include teachings attributed to Jesus that emphasize inner transformation over outward conformity, and some align in meaningful ways with ancient manuscripts uncovered in the 20th century. Figures like Mel Gibson have publicly pointed toward these differences, suggesting that parts of the story may have been overlooked in the West. Whether you see that as spiritually significant or historically intriguing, the pattern remains. Certain texts were preserved, others were set aside, and the gap between them remained largely unnoticed for centuries. That gap sat in the Ethiopian highlands, written in a language few outside the region could read, protected by geography, tradition, and dedication. It survived empires, colonization, and centuries of change, And now, through the work of translators like Ephraim Isaac and Getachew Haley, along with discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, those texts are becoming accessible to the wider world. The information is no longer hidden. The question now is what you do with it. Because the monks who preserved these writings didn't do it for curiosity, they believed the message mattered. And now that it's within reach, it's up to each person to decide what it means.